Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to talk about Polimanteia, this work, the title page you see before you. A work that's very dear actually to my heart because I've been non-Stratfordian, I suppose, for 20 years, 25 years, in which time I was seeing that the evidence for the Earl of Oxford was better than for any other candidate, but it seemed to lack one central very, very important thing, which was contemporary evidence, contemporary saying that he was Shakespeare. And I found it in 2013, and so it was from this that I came out of my closet, as it were, as an Oxfordian. And of course, as you will know if you've been following my uploads, I found really an awful number since then, a huge number of contemporaries who were saying that Shakespeare was a pseudonym used by the Earl of Oxford. But this was the first one I found. I realised at the time when I found it that it was telling us a lot more than just who Shakespeare was. And that's what I want to show you today. It's hiding a sex scandal in 12 lines, not in the main title essay, Polimanteia, but in an attached essay entitled A Letter from England to Her Three Daughters, Cambridge, Oxford and the Inns of Court. The fact that Shakespeare's mentioned at all in this has always been a cause of questioning. Why should Shakespeare be mentioned in a book that is essentially about Oxford, Cambridge and Inns of Court? He was not at either of those. Let's say Shakespeare of Stratford was not at any of them. And everybody mentioned in this was. So that's how anti-Stratfordians have looked at this up to now. But we've now dug much deeper and know exactly what it's saying and what's going on. I want you to notice that it was published in Cambridge. There was a hornet's nest of people anti the Earl of Oxford in Cambridge in 1595, and what you're about to see is obviously a libel on the Earl of Oxford and his entourage, and hidden in here. I want you just to look too very quickly at this Latin quotation, which I will translate as envy, do not seize upon that which cannot be imitated. Nothing benefits the mind and eyes that does not come at a cost. So it's telling you right there on the front cover to use your mind and your eyes when you're reading this. Don't just read it through and look at the surface meaning. Really concentrate with your eye of mind and your ocular eye if you're to understand it. So that's exactly what we're going to do. The passage we're going to look at is here. These are the 12 lines from this essay. England to her three daughters. There you'll note in the margin note there, sweet Shakespeare. Very interesting because Shakespeare is only mentioned actually in print 5 times in the 1590s, and this is one of those times. So it's obviously quite important. Now, I think the first thing to do is try to get a grip of the surface meaning, surface message, and then once we've got that, we'll look underneath and see what it's really saying. Okay, let other countries, sweet Cambridge, envy yet admire my Virgil, thy Petrarch, divine Spencer. In other words, Cambridge University do try and encourage people from other countries to get behind Spencer, who was an alumnus at Cambridge University. And unless I err, a thing easy in such simplicity, deluded by dearly beloved Delia and fortunately fortunate Cleopatra. He's saying, unless I misinterpret, these 2 works by Samuel Daniel, Delia and Cleopatra, Oxford, that's Oxford University of course, thou mayst extol thy court dear verse happy Daniel. In other words, Oxford University, you must praise Daniel, who was an alumnus at Oxford University and whose verse is beloved of the court, whose sweet refined muse in contracted shape. Well, I can't give you an obvious surface meaning there. Let's just simplify it, and I will come back to that and explain what it means as the hidden meaning. But let's for the moment just say whose sweet muse were sufficient amongst men to gain pardon of the sin to Rosamond. Rosamond is another poem by Samuel Daniel. It's about a sinful woman who is persuaded by a matron to creep into the room of a married man, who's actually the king, and have sexual intercourse with him. So, in other words, Daniel's muse is so good, his poems are so good that it helps us to pardon that sin of Rosamond, to pity distressed Cleopatra. At the beginning of Samuel Daniel's play, Cleopatra is bemoaning the fact that she has to send her bastard, her illegitimate child away, never to be seen again. She's very upset. So, again, Samuel Daniel's poem is so good that we pity her, and it's so good that it endows ever-living praise to her loving Delia, and that's a reference to Samuel Daniel's Delia sonnets. These sonnets addressed to Delia, so we praise her ever-living, immortal praise to Delia. And then the sentence just after that, register your children's pedigree in fame's forehead. In other words, all you universities, Oxford, Cambridge and Inns of Court, jolly well make a fuss and show off about your students and ex-students who are famous. So that's what it basically means. There is your surface meaning. Now, I'm saying that it's got some hidden meanings, and the first thing is to say what clues are there that there's something going on underneath. You look at the beginning again, and unless I err, a thing easy in such simplicity, deluded by... I mean, you don't normally start a sentence saying, now look, unless I'm making a terrible mistake, unless I'm just seeing the surface, the simplicity, unless I'm deluded by the simplicity. That is, I think, a hint to say, dear reader, just check that there isn't something behind the simplicity of what I appear to be saying, that I'm actually saying something else. So it's a big spur, really, to look more deeply at this passage. This bit I said before, Daniel, whose sweet, refined muse in contracted shape. Well, honestly, I mean, you know, normally a really good encryption is so well done that you can't tell anything's hidden there at all, but this is crying out for de-encryption. It's telling you it's a crossword clue, really. A sweet, refined muse in contracted shape. Big clue that things are hidden here. I think the use of her, the ever-losing praise to her loving Delia, is a little bit confusing. Could have been better done if you're trying to hide it. This is an odd way of putting things. Register your children's pedigree in fame's forehead. Pedigree, of course, is registered or drawn up by a family tree in branches. As soon as you start putting foreheads and branches together, we're talking about cuckoldry. Children of cuckolds are not actually their children. I think that's giving a foretaste about what this scandal is about. So I think there are plenty of reasons to think there's something odd going on, and of course Shakespearean experts have had 400 years to tell us why, for instance, wanton Adonis is written against those two lines, why eloquent Gaveston is written against those lines, Lucretia against those, etc., 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 let alone sweet Shakespeare against that line. No, they have no idea, normal Stratfordian scholars. Well, I hope you're pleased. I'm going to explain all of this now. How shall we start to decrypt this thing? Let's look at this triangle of names. Delia at the top, Cleopatra, Oxford underneath, thy court, dear verse, bit like a pediment at the bottom. Is that an accident? Is this triangle put there by sheer accident? First thing to say, of course, is we do see a lot of triangles in text in this day and in this period. They're known as trickets. In fact, we saw 3 upside-down trickets in the dedication to Shakespeare Sonnets of 1609. If this is a deliberate tricket, is it deliberately put there? Why do I say there is of any interest? Well, look how the L of simplicity above the word Delia lines up precisely with the semicolon below Delia, which in itself matches with the base point of the L, the middle word of Delia. If I were to draw a line straight down the middle there, what you'll find is that that triangle is directly centered to the text band. In fact, I can prove it to you really by drawing a line and doing it again and then moving it over across. Actually, if you measure the original copy, I've seen it in the Bodleian, it's precisely 2 inches either side. So it's a 4-inch text band with 2 inches either side. So it is bang in the center, this triangle, which really makes you think that it was put there deliberately as a kind of a brick, a triangular brick in a wall, and then of course all the other words cemented around it to hide it, to obscure it. With a little clue here that it's deliberate as well. I think you can see the space between Cleopatra and that centered semicolon is much smaller than the space between Oxford and the semicolon. Obviously Oxford is a shorter word than Cleopatra, so Oxford has to be pushed out a bit to the right to make sure that the triangle is symmetrical. And equally, if you look at this great clump here, everything's all a bit too tight together. The reason for that is he wants to get "and fortunately" in there and ensure at the same time that Delia is centered. So there's lots of evidence that that triangle is deliberately set there. And what I'm going to argue in this presentation, I'm going to show you, I hope, utterly compelling evidence to convince you that it is the case, that these 3 names are not what you think they are. They're actually representing real people in 1595 who were involved in a terrible scandal. I'm going to show evidence that Oxford is not, on this reading, the University of Oxford, but it's actually the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. And you can see there are three names here, so we're looking at some sort of triangle if all three are involved in a scandal. Edward de Vere wrote a set of sonnets called Shakespeare Sonnets. If you want that fact proved, please look at my uploads called Where is Shakespeare Really Buried? And it's proved beyond doubt, mathematically. It's over that question, so let's just get on with what we now know. So Edward de Vere writes Shakespeare Sonnets, and in the first person in Shakespeare Sonnets we realise that the poet is involved in a terrible, appalling mess, a scandal. He says that his name has received a brand, that he's despised, shamed, and vile esteemed. He's in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, has made himself a motley to the view. He bemoans his outcast state, suffers bewailed guilt because of a vulgar scandal stamped upon his brow. Remember, this is all written in the first person. What's he going to do about it? Well, he's going to disappear. If you read this line, remember not the hand that writ it. In me each part will be forgotten, my name be buried where my body is, and live no more to shame nor me nor you. After my death forget me quite, no longer mourn me when I am dead. Do not so much as my poor name rehearse, for I once gone to all the world must die. I mean, these lines alone are very helpful to explaining why it is that Edward de Vere did essentially disappear behind the pseudonym Shakespeare. Okay, but the sonnets are very much dealing with this scandal. You'll probably remember that they begin with 17 sonnets in a row telling a fair youth to procreate, known as the Procreation Sonnets. Have a boy for love of me, he says. And that he says that this fair youth, who's not named in the sonnets, shares a mistress with him. So we've got a triangular situation in the sonnets, and clearly, well, I say clearly, but it sort of leads to that conclusion, let's say, that if there's a terrible scandal being talked about in the sonnets, and there's this threesome going on, that very possibly the threesome lies at the heart of the scandal. That's what I'm going to show that this is about. So Oxford is Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Cleopatra, we're going to see, is Lady Penelope Rich. She, funnily enough, was the very first person ever to be identified as the Dark Lady of the Sonnets, as long back as 1888. The man who wrote the book on that, called Massey, had absolutely no idea how much evidence would surface supporting his case since his death, since the publication of that book. We now know an enormous amount more about it, and she is a very, very strong candidate indeed as the Dark Lady, and I'm going to show that this contemporary regards her certainly as the Dark Lady. Anyway, she's the sister of the Earl of Essex, so she's quite highly placed. She was married to a man called Lord Rich, who she didn't like very much. She had a number of children out of wedlock in adulterous liaisons. She was much derided and cursed by people in her day. She was called a whore and a harlot and an adulteress by her contemporary Champernowne, Richard Champernowne. But she was also very clever, she was very cultured, she was very attractive, and poets loved her. Philip Sidney wrote his Astrophel and Stella sonnets to her and about her, calling her Stella, and lots of other poets loved her. She was very, including Shakespeare, obviously, as her mistress. So that's Penelope Rich, and the third person in the triangle, you can probably guess, is represented by Delia in this work, and he is Henry Rosalie, the third Earl of Southampton, who was quite young. He was engaged to Oxford's daughter at this time. He was a terrible narcissist. He was very beautiful, and we find quite a lot of references, particularly, I mean, in the sonnets themselves, Shakespeare's sonnets, complaining of his narcissism, very keen on looking at himself and being in love with himself. And he is, as many, many scholars have accepted, he is the unnamed fair youth of Shakespeare's sonnets. So I am going to show that these three names are Oxford, Delia and Cleopatra, are actually hiding allusions to these people, and they're talking about a scandal. What was the scandal? Well, I can explain it pretty simply to you. This honey-tongued lord persuaded this fair youth and no doubt persuaded this Dark Lady to get together and procreate and have a baby, just as in fact there's evidence of that sitting there in the sonnets, have a baby for love of me, keep saying 17 times. The baby was born, and the baby was brought up as Henry de Vere, named Henry, of course, after Henry Roseley, but brought up as Henry de Vere and became the 18th Earl of Oxford. That might not seem like a terrible scandal in this day and age. Surrogacy, of course, is quite a common thing, but you have to remember back then we are talking about a secret surrogacy that took place between some very high up people in court, and of course the baby had no business, if he was the natural son of Henry Roseley, growing up to inherit the titles of Edward de Vere and become Earl of Oxford. But that is what happened. I'm only going to give evidence about this as it's concerned in this document called Polimanteia. If you want to find more about it, please go to Google and type in Shakespeare's vulgar scandal and my name, Waugh, and you'll find quite a long talk that I gave in Ashland in America, and I give a lot of evidence about this scandal that is not given here. Equally, some evidence that isn't given in Ashland or here you can find by looking at my upload, which is called Where Shakespeare is Really Buried, part 2 out of 4. That's on YouTube. Don't be confused. It rather oddly says that it's the concluding part. Actually, there are 4 parts, and this is the second part, which shows unequivocally that the 18th Earl of Oxford, Henry Vere, was actually Southampton's natural son. Okay, so that's what I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you how this works to do that. So we've seen that these 3 names might be hiding. Let's start with this one, Oxford, and I'm going to show you how this Oxford isn't just the surface meaning Oxford University, but actually it represents Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, most specifically the 17th Earl of Oxford. Now, if you count the full words from the bottom, so ignore that A hyphen which belongs to the word amongst on the top of the right-hand page, count from sufficient, were, shape, contracted, in, muse, count backwards, and you'll find the 17th word from the bottom is Oxford. Of course, he was 17th Earl of Oxford, and you'll see that he's followed by a T, and that's actually the 4th T on this line. I am sorry to anyone who has come to this particular presentation as the first one of my presentations to come to, because anyone who's seen a lot of them will know that time and time again we see Oxford Shakespeare represented by the numbers 1740. Ben Jonson does it, Francis Mears does it, the Sonnets dedication does it. The whole thing comes to a great culmination, in fact, when a monument to William Shakespeare is placed right above where Edward de Vere is buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey in 1740. All of this stuff is on previous uploads on my YouTube channel, so if you're not familiar with it, please take a look, but I think it would be unfair on people who are following what I'm doing if I gave too much detail about 1740. I'll leave it here just to say 17 obviously represents 17th Earl of Oxford, and the 4 T's is Shakespeare as Hermes. It's the 4th T as Hermes Mercury. Okay, let's move on. We don't get stuck on that. So 1740 is Oxford Shakespeare, and there is Shakespeare's name in the margent, Sweet Shakespeare. And that margent is lined up very precisely and very carefully on this line, which has an extraordinary and rather unique epithet, court dear verse, all hyphenated together. Actually, what this is known as a charade, which is a little hidden name. It's usually always a name, placed in its correct word and letter order, hidden there. So you can see our de Vere in the correct letter and word order is hidden in court dear verse, and the rest of the letters rearranged form a very tidy anagram of a secret. So essentially what's going on there, we've got hidden our de Vere a secret, which is annotated by the margent note Sweet Shakespeare. Underneath Oxford is 17th Earl of Oxford, and he's 1740. I'm just going to put that back as it was to court dear verse because there's a little bit more to it. We looked at that 1740. Just look above the T. You see the word for, emphasizing the 40. and above that you see the letter D. Those of you who have followed my encryption, de-encryption I should say, of the title page of Shakespeare Sonnets from 1609 will remember that we looked very closely at this line of 17 letters and decoded it in fact as saying by God and the 17th Earl of Oxford. In the centre of it you can see T and 4 in front of it, 40, so that's your 1740, but let's look closely at this D for T. Notice how that T has looked like an ox's head, while the T next to it is in the same swash font as the G. And there's a reason for that, because T, as tau, is the ancient symbol of an ox. D for T means swap your D for your T. So if you swap D for T with ox as the symbol, you have Oxford. So D for T is a way of encrypting the name Oxford. So if we see it here, we have D for T. Notice how deliberate it is actually. You'll see the stem of the D is precisely lined up to the stem of the T, going right through the very centre of 4. You'll also notice it going from left to right as well. D for T. So you get that twice, Oxford, Oxford, and then the italicized Oxford. That makes 3 times. And you'll be aware that tria sunt omnia, 3s are all. Very often these encryptions are validated by doing things 3 times, and this is another example of that. I should point out as well that looking from the left to right, D for T, that 4T is on the beginning of fortunately, and fortunately is the 17th word of that sentence, which begins and unless I err a thing. So you have another 1740 there as well. Okay, I think I've gone long enough on explaining why Oxford is Oxford, and I hope you can see it's very watertight. Oxford, 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 Shakespeare, Hour de Vere, 1740, etc. Okay, so Oxford is clearly alluding to the name of a person there, the Earl of Oxford, and as I say, Cleopatra is a dark lady, so let's look at how this identifies Penelope Rich. As I said, Cleopatra is a play by Samuel Daniel. It's about a very dark lady indeed, who has to give up her illegitimate son, who's Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, and she's in a great mourning state about it. Of course, she commits suicide. Why, therefore, would you call her fortunate Cleopatra? Clearly, she's not fortunate in the sense of lucky. There's a bit of a clue about what fortunate means, i.e. possessed of a fortune. Of course, Cleopatra was very rich. Fortunately, fortunate means richly rich. There's a little joke about that. Many people used to talk about Penelope Rich in terms of being fortunate. Here's a little poem published in 1600 to Penelope Rich, Lady Rich. To descant on my name, as many do, I should but allude unto that which with it compared is. Yet to be rich was to be fortunate, and all esteemed, and yet though so thou art, thou wast much more than most unfortunate, though richly well. Anyway, you can see what's going on. This poet is playing with the word fortunate and rich, and saying that lots of other poets have done the same in connection with Lady Rich. So calling her fortunate, although she's actually unlucky, she's unfortunate. But fortunate and rich are synonymous. So we've got richly rich, fortunately fortunate, and then we have a margent note, Lucretia. Well, that is obviously in one way referring to the poem by Shakespeare called The Rape of Lucrece. Lucrece is actually an interesting name, and it's there for a reason. It's because the name Lucretia comes from the Latin lucrum, as indeed do the English words lucre, as in filthy lucre, and lucrative. And so the name Lucretia means rich. In fact, it was much more associated with riches earlier. In the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries, you will often find Lucrece, as in the Rape of Lucrece, spelled Lucres, lucres, which is exactly how at that time they spelt filthy lucres, meaning riches or money. So essentially what's going on here is we've got 3 times, just as we had Oxford 3 times, tria sunt omnia, 3s are all richly, richly rich. So there we have an identity for Cleopatra. Hope I'm not taking too long over this. Try to get on to the third and final one, Delia. which I'm going to show you, is a reference to Henry Roseley, the third Earl of Southampton. Delia, as I said, is a set of sonnets by Samuel Daniel, addressed to someone called Delia. And for a long time we've had so-called scholars of English literature trying to work out who Delia was. Was she actually a real person? Well, no, she wasn't. She's called Delia for a very good reason, because Delia is a kind of reflection on the name Daniel. A Delian is a follower of Apollo, excuse me. And the reason Daniel chose the word Delia is because he wants it to be a reflection of his own name, because these sonnets are in fact about a man sitting by the water and looking at his own reflection and thinking that he's seeing a beautiful woman. In other words, they are sonnets about a narcissist, hence Daniel Delia. Daniel says of the Delia poems, he says they are poems uttered to myself. I made music to myself that pleased me best, he says about them. So he's giving a great clue about how these sonnets work. And I really advise that you read them, because it's great fun picking up all these many, many clues that he doesn't overtly tell us that he's actually looking at his own reflection. In the sonnets, he says, for instance, my love, youth, and plaints are reflected in this poor river. In other words, he's seeing himself in the river. He says that Delia casts water-cold disdain upon my face. Well, that's quite a funny joke. Obviously, if you try to kiss your own reflection in the water, you're going to get water-cold disdain on your face. And he says, the Avon, the river, Avon, rich in fame, shall have my song where Delia hath her seat. I'll sound her name, the river all along. So Delia has her seat. What he's seeing is the reflection of himself sitting by the river, by the Avon where he used to live. But it would seem that he's writing them about the narcissism of Southampton. So if this is about Southampton, we don't have a great deal of clue here. We've got dearly beloved. Well, I suppose Shakespeare addresses the fair youth in his sonnets as dear my love, but I don't think that's a huge clue, nor in fact you could say is Earl hidden in there. I would rather dismiss that as a non-clue myself. No, the whole proof of the matter lies very cleverly hidden in the margin note again. Why I say it's clever, it's kind of brilliant because it looks so innocent, that margin note. All praiseworthy dot. Actually, there's something a tiny bit suspicious about it, I suppose, is that all it's doing is clapping from the sidelines. On the whole, margin notes are not placed there just to say well done. Margin notes are there to elucidate something in the line that they're set against, or to give us some example, give us some focus on to make something easier to understand. Okay, so all praiseworthy doesn't really do that. Actually, it is a very perfect anagram, including the dot, of Parallel dot Roseley. Some of you might not know what parallel dot means, but I can assure you that any scholar in 1595 would have known absolutely precisely what parallel dot means, because it's very, very common particularly in margin notes and footnotes. You see it time and time again. If you go to early English books online, you can find over 1,300 examples of parallel dot in margin notes. It is, of course, an abbreviation of parallel, which means analogous, corresponding, equivalent, or equal to, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. So it's clear what's going on here. Then we have dearly beloved Delia, and then that is corresponding to, equivalent, or equal to Roseley. So brilliant, this actually. You see how he uses the dot, how the anagram is completely perfect. And as I say, if there hadn't been a scandal involved in this, if we weren't trying to hide the fact that Roseley was represented by Delia, he would have simply put that note exactly like you see it, parallel dot Roseley. That's how it would have been done. Instead, this beautiful, brilliant, all praiseworthy dot. Okay, so now we know who the three characters are. I am going to proceed, and just to make it easier, I'm going to put the lower left and the top right parts together so we don't have to keep jetting our eyes back up and down. Okay, first thing I'd like to show you here is this. Is that sheer coincidence? Is that luck? I don't know. It looks a bit like a capital T. It could be the hilt of a sword. Remember, in the Renaissance times, the pen and the sword were rather sort of interchangeable ideas. Anyway, it contains the message, "Yet admire my pen in libel." And as you may remember, on the title page, we were told to use our eyes and our mind to find clues here. So that's exactly what I've done, and I found that. I'm still slightly sitting on the fence whether it's on purpose or not, but I will say that we do have a libel hidden right here, so it certainly makes sense that it's there. And as I said, it's published in Cambridge. I must recommend to you a book. It's called An Anatomy of the Relic Controversy, written by Elizabeth Appleton. In that book, she shows that that the Earl of Oxford is threatened by Gabriel Harvey, who's a Don at Cambridge University, that he will expose some dreadful scandal about Oxford if Oxford's servant, who's Thomas Nash, doesn't immediately apologise for some writings he's been doing. And Nash does apologise, in fact, but the libel seems to be contained in this Cambridge literature anyway. So I think that's very interesting. But anyway, now we know who these people are, let's concentrate on that. Delia's name appears twice, and as we saw, is got a margin note explaining that's equivalent to Roseley, so Henry Roseley. So let's put HW, the initials, on the two occasions. Oxford, well, yeah, we did that. We saw that how sweet Shakespeare he is, our De Vere secret, 17th Earl of Oxford, 1740, etc., etc. So let's put EDV, Edward De Vere, over his name. And Cleopatra, and we've seen she's rich, 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 fortunately fortunate, and Lucretia, and her name appears twice in this section. So let's put her name, Penelope Rich, over the two Cleopatras. Now, I can see you're saying, yippee, that's solved that. Now let's just read it through and it will all make a lot of sense. Unfortunately, there's still another catch, and we have to get this catch right, or we're not going to make sense of it. I did allude to it before. It's this bit. Daniel, whose sweet, refined muse in contracted shape. As I said, a very obvious crossword puzzle. So we're going to have to think with our minds and our eyes. What is this refined muse in contracted shape? Well, you have the verb were coming after it. That could mean it's something in the plural. However, it could mean it's a subjunctive, so you can't put too much basis on that. Well, what are we saying about the muse in contracted shape? It were sufficient amongst men to gain pardon of the sin to Rosamond. Okay, well, so it's able to pardon a sin. It's able to pity distressed Penelope Rich. What can pardon and what can pity? I think the biggest clue probably comes in the last bit. And offers ever-living praise to her loving Henry Roseley. Well, we'll come on to Henry Roseley's love for Penelope Rich in a second. But if it offers ever-living praise, ever-living means immortal forever, i.e. long after Henry Roseley's dead. So we are obviously talking about some form of art, symphony or poem. Actually, it's most obviously a poem because this whole section is about poems and poetry, so I think we can guess it's a poem. Okay, so a poem, supposedly by Henry Roseley, which will make him immortal, the clue to which is Daniel, whose sweet, refined muse in contracted shape. Let's think about that. Daniel's muse. Well, we know that Daniel's muse is Delia, because he wrote the Delia Sonnets. So we're going to contract the shape of Delia. Let's take out the E and the I and push the D and the A together. So we've got DLA. Obviously, it'd be much easier for a Renaissance person to de-encrypt this because they don't say ABC like we do. They say RBC. It's pronounced R, that letter. So a Renaissance fellow would be saying DLR, DLR to himself a couple of times and say, oh, DLR. Yes. Are there any poems by the title DLR? Well, the truth is that, yes, there are. They're known as DLR, certain sonnets. They are not the most brilliant sonnets, I have to say, but they're worth reading. They're very influenced by the poet Thomas Watson, particularly his Hecatompathia, set of poems published in 1582. Diella leans on them very heavily, actually borrows sentences from them. The Hecatompathia, by the way, were dedicated to the Earl of Oxford, so if these are by Southampton, I would guess that Southampton was introduced to these sonnets by the Earl of Oxford, who was very passionate about the Hecatompathia, the Thomas Watson sonnets. You'll see that actually there's a bit of a pseudonym going here by R.L. Gentleman. I can't tell you why the Earl of Southampton decided to call himself R.L. It could be to do with Roseley. It's a bit of a clue. I think he went on to write other things actually under R.L. and expanding it to different names like Richard Lynch. But that's for another time. The Earl of Southampton loved Italian. He learnt Italian from John Florio and was a bit of a sort of Italophile. So here you have a nice Italian quotation. Ben balla a chi fortuna suona, which means he for whom fortune sounds or for whom fortune pipes dances well. He dances well for whom fortune sings. Obviously there's the joke there on fortune. We've seen that already about Penelope Rich. Rich's fortunes. So there's a little clue there. He's saying, I've written jolly good poems for Penelope Rich. 1596, that is actually the year after Polimanteia. But we know for certain that these sonnets, the Diella sonnets, were known before 1596. They're referred to in 1595 in a poem by Thomas Edwards, which is all about Narcissus, and it's linked very much to the Southampton scandal. And actually, even more tellingly, these poems are parodied in a wonderful poem called Willoughby His Avisa. And what's amazing about that is the funny parodies of the Diella sonnets are coming out of the mouth of someone who is named simply H.W., the initials H.W. Clearly that's Henry Roseley. So it's another confirmation that these are in fact by Henry Roseley, and they were known about before 1596. Okay, so we know that this Daniel whose sweet refined muse in contracted shape is a reference to the Diella sonnets. So let's put the Diella sonnets in there. Now we know it's the Diella sonnets, what can we make of this margent note, eloquent Gaveston? Eloquent obviously means brilliant with words, very good with words, so it's a reference to the poet who wrote the Diella sonnets, who we now know is Henry Roseley. So why has he been called eloquent Gaveston here? Well, this is a reference to a poem by Michael Drayton called Piers Gaveston, Earl of Cornwall, reappeared, this first published in 1594, so it's exactly the same time, and later appeared under the title Legend of Piers Gaveston. You must read this poem if you're interested in this scandal, because of course it's all about the scandal. The Legend of Piers Gaveston is about a beautiful fair youth called Piers Gaveston, who is doted upon by a prince called Edward, as though he were Edward de Vere, doting on this fair youth, Gaveston, as though he were Henry Roseley. He showers him with gifts. He tries to get the fair youth to marry his niece, just like the Edward Earl of Oxford tried to get the Earl of Southampton to marry his daughter. And he showers Gaveston with gifts and also gives him titles. One of the most telling clues in this is the Prince Edward gives the title to Piers Gaveston of Lord High Chamberlain of England. Well, the only Edward who owned that title was, of course, Edward de Vere. It was his unique hereditary title. So it's a bit of a clue in this poem that this is all about Edward de Vere and Southampton, which ended up in this poem in a great court scandal, of course. So well done, Drayton, for writing that, and that explains, so it's a very interesting note, it explains that the author of the Diella Sonnets, who's Southampton, is also I won't say lampooned, but is represented as Gaveston in Drayton's poem. Okay, so the Diella Sonnets were sufficient amongst men to gain pardon for the sin of Rosamond. The sin of Rosamond, as I may have said, is being persuaded to go into a married person's bedroom and have sexual intercourse. Interesting here we have the footnote, wanton Adonis. If you read Venus and Adonis by Shakespeare, it's hard to see that he's wanton in the sense that he's actually running away from Venus's ever-pressing demands for sex and love. Actually, if you read the poem very, very carefully, you'll see that there's a wonderful scene in it in which Venus pretends to pass out and Adonis becomes extremely wanton and gets on top of her and kisses her all over and has a sort of sex scene. So that's the sin of Rosamond. Wanton Adonis, very interesting because obviously it's telling us, a lot of people already guessed, that Southampton is represented as Adonis in Shakespeare's poem, and we know of course that we are talking about Southampton here because it's Adonis Watson's heir. As I said, the Diella Sonnets are very, very heavily influenced by the poems of Thomas Watson, so by calling Wanton Adonis Southampton Watson's heir, it's again confirmation, as if it were needed, that Henry Rosalie is the author of these Diella Sonnets and influenced by Watson. Okay, ever-living praise to her loving Rosalie. We'll go to that loving bit in just a second. Register your children's pedigree in fame's forehead. As I said, that's to do with cuckoldry. To branch means to be cuckolded. Branches on someone's forehead are all about cuckoldry. So it's a stark warning, and it's telling us really what this huge scandal is about. Okay, so I just want to have a look a little bit again at the Diella Sonnets, because I think they're very interesting and they tell us something extremely interesting that's going on to do with the literature in these years. So Rosalie writes the Diella Sonnets, and he writes them to Penelope Rich, and he praises her extravagantly in them. He praises, for instance, my mistress' snow-white skin. Now, as we know from the Shakespeare sonnets, Shakespeare is sharing this mistress with the fair youth. He's a bit cross that the fair youth has fallen in love with her, if you remember the sonnets. And he actually goes off the Dark Lady entirely and gets really cross about her. So he reads Rosalie's poem, the Diella Sonnets, and sees that he's saying my mistress' snow-white skin. And he writes in sonnet 130, he writes, if snow be white, why then her breasts are done. He reads in the Diella Sonnets, her eyes are more glorious to behold than midday sun. Shakespeare rebuts that rebuts that in sonnet 130. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. She has sweet lips of coral hue, according to Southampton. Edward de Vere says coral is far more red than her lips. She has sweet breath that breathes incomparable sweetness. No, says Edward de Vere, in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. All of this coming out of sonnet 130. Southampton praises her fair cheeks of purest roses, red and white, and Shakespeare argues, I have seen roses damask red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. Her voice, says Southampton, of Penelope's voice, her voice is more sweet than famous Tamira's, reviving death with Doric melodies. And Shakespeare argues, I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. So you can see what's happening here. We have Southampton writing sonnets, which clearly he's showing to his chum. Edward de Vere is rather besotted by him, and Edward de Vere is slightly irritated that he's fallen in love with his mistress. And he writes sonnets in reply that get published again quite a lot later. And so what we're getting here is a conversation. Poems are speaking to other poems. Michael Drayton in his Piers Gaveston is responding to other poems. And we constantly hear from the Stratfordian apologists, we hear, oh yes, Michael Drayton was influenced by Venus and Adonis, or he copied little bits or little ideas. It's much more interesting than that. It's not just copying them, he's talking. They're talking to each other through printed pamphlets of poems, just in the same way that in the Mar-Prelate controversy we see conversations going on between Thomas Nash and Gabriel Harvey, etc. So these works, which are all named, are talking about this scandal. If you look to the left there, Samuel Daniels' publication in 1594, the same year as Piers Gaveston is published, and he includes Delia, Rosamond, and Cleopatra, all three of those works. Some of you will be aware that there's a very satirical and funny play about this time, put on at Cambridge, in which a man called Gullio is a very obvious lampoon of the Earl of Southampton, and Gullio comes onto the stage and quotes a bit of Shakespeare, and the person on the stage says, oh, here he goes, mark my words, next thing is he'll run through a whole book of Samuel Daniels. Well, that's a joke, of course. He's talking about this book, Delia, Rosamond and Cleopatra, saying that Southampton runs all the way through it. Indeed, he does. He is the theme of all those pieces, Delia, Rosamond and Cleopatra. He is the theme because of his terrible scandal that he got involved with Penelope Rich and Edward de Vere. So we see Venus and Adonis, and you can read that very easily, and I explain it in the Vulgar Scandal, which I sent you to look at. How the scandal is involved in Venus and Adonis, how it is about that. Really interesting, the dedication from Shakespeare, of course, to Southampton, in which he calls Southampton the godfather to the first heir of my invention. Well, clearly the first heir is his 18th Earl of Oxford, which he's invented by getting this surrogacy, and Henry Rosalie is the godfather, i.e. known to God as the natural father. And of course, Lucrece, again, a poem about someone who is persuaded really by the words description of this beautiful wife, and he's worked up into a great lust, and so he goes into her room and rapes her. So we have this common theme of a persuader, honey-tongued persuader. You get it in Rosamond, you get it in Lucrece, you get it in Venus and Adonis. The persuader, that is what Edward de Vere is, who persuades Henry Rosalie, and we know how he does that, partly we know from the first 17 sonnets, to go and procreate, to have a boy for love of me, with Penelope Rich. Now clearly there's a lot more to this, a lot more evidence, but I'm going to leave it there. I will post up more things as we go along, but I hope you're excited by this, excited enough perhaps, to go and read some of those poems. Please, if you're interested, press the subscribe button and the bell next to it, and then you'll be notified every time I put one up, because I will be continuing to show more and more evidence of this exciting, really interesting and important scandal, totally overlooked by Stratfordian scholars. What to expect. Thank you very much. Goodbye.